Spider Weekend is finally here. So while we wait to find out how many Spider-Mans are there, let's paint up the amazing Spider-Man from Marvel Crisis Protocol.
That the entirety of the cosmos is accessible through each and every individual's mind, connecting to the great mind, the great spirit.
Welcome back to the Studio Collectors. I know it's been a while since we've uploaded a video, but this one's really special. We are going to make a deviation from our usual video from Games Workshop, and we are going to be painting the amazing Spider-Man from Marvel Crisis Protocol. What really attracted me to this model was the very intricate and dynamic poses, and what really blows my mind is that Atomic Games actually managed to sculpt the web in one piece and it doesn't break. So for today, we'll be learning how to paint up not just Spider-Man but the explosion effects next to him on that Daily Bugle scaffolding, as well as how we can allow some of these light effects to leak on Spider-Man himself. So before we go on to the concept, remember to like and subscribe so you can see more videos such as this and be notified whenever we do drop a video. Alright, so on to the concept. So for the concept for this Spider-Man, what I really want to achieve is that 1 second freeze frame effect where the explosion has just gone off, the smoke plumes are all out, and a bit of that red-orange light is leaking onto Spider-Man. So that's going to be very important for us to illustrate onto this very dynamically sculpted model right here. So because this is going to be a display level model, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the very intricate volumes and details on Spider-Man's body and pay very close attention to the color temperature changes. How I'm going to be doing this is I'm going to moderate the amount of orange paint that I'm going to be using, not just on the red areas, but on the blue areas as well. This is a little bit challenging because, as we all know, when we add blue to orange, you get sort of a grey. So we're going to be working with a lot of warm greys to suggest that this warm light is coming from the explosion. Next up will be the explosion, because the explosion is going to be really dynamic. But the important thing is that we got to remember that the explosion isn't the light source itself. The real light source is within the explosion, so you want to focus on the little cracks and the crevices which happen to be the areas closest to the explosion. That's where we're going to be placing the light sources. And after that, it's all the other debris and finishing off the model. I'm really excited to see the movie. However, let's go on to the first stage where we put paint on the model, which is the airbrushing stage. Welcome to the first stage, which is going to be airbrushing the model. The model has already been primed black and we're going to go on with the airbrushing. In this stage, I'm going to be using a little bit of fluorescent orange to suggest some color temperature changes closer to the explosion, while I'm going to be using white grey near the light source to suggest the source light to make sure that the model looks as awesome as possible. For this stage, I'll be using these colors right here. Alternatively, these Games Workshop colors will work just fine. Alright, so let's gather up all these colors and let's put them into the airbrush and start airbrushing this amazing looking model right now. Okay, so first off we're going to be using fluorescent orange, and I'm going to do this sort of like a reverse zenithal highlight. I'm going to be doing it from the bottom. I think where this suggests is eventually when I apply colors over the model, there's going to be a hint of warmth and fluorescence from the bottom left hand corner. Next up, I'm going to be using white grey. Reason why I'm using white grey rather than pure white is I don't want the values to be pushed to an extreme before starting any painting. I'm liberally doing this as a zenithal highlight from the top right hand corner. I'm going to be using this as an opposing source light so that Spider-Man is also lit with a secondary light source rather than only having one light source. Alright, so now we are done with the airbrushing and we are going to move on to the red areas of Spider-Man. This stage is particularly important because I cover how to paint red. Painting red can be a little bit challenging because you can't just add white to the red. If you add white to the red, what you end up with is a little bit of a pink. Fortunately for us, because the source light is going to be a warm light from the explosion, what we're going to do is we're progressively going to be adding some orange to multiple types of reds that I'll be using. I'll be using nearly the entire range of the AK range, so that's going to be a treat. So for this stage, I'm going to be using these colors right here. Alternatively, these colors will work just fine from Games Workshop. Alright, so let's get out all these colors and let's get painting the red suit on Spider-Man right now. Alright, so first and foremost, I'm going to be doing some layering and I'm going to be using blood red. At this time, I'm going to be focused on areas that are exposed and looking generally more white rather than black. So this is where I apply this very carefully and paying very close attention to the shapes of the model. So as you can see, this is not just base coating, it's more of like blocking out shapes. So now, once the blood red is done, I'm going to move on to the next value, which is vermilion. Notice that I'm moving from a warmer red to a cooler red, and I'm going to be using the cooler reds for the shadow. Why I'm going to be using this cooler red for the shadow is because I want this cool red to have some contrast with the warm orange light that will be used later on. Next up, I'm going to be using burnt red. So burnt red is going to be the shadow color, and right here I'm going to be using burnt red to block out the shadows, and this is particularly important because these are the areas that were black previously, and I'm going to be using this as a pretty low value area. Okay, next up, I'm going to be mixing dead red and a little bit of blood red to be used as the highlight color. As I mentioned in the introduction, red is a very touchy color and you can't just add white into the mix. So as such, I'm going to be using dead red as the highlight color, mixing it in with blood red. Okay, next up I'm going to be using this panel liner from AK. This is just a black wash to get into the crevices. And if you don't have this, it's fine, you can always just use noun oil from Games Workshop. However, the benefit of using a enamel wash is that I can clean it off later and it makes it look very clean. So now that the red areas have been painted, we move on to the next most significant color, which is the blue on Spider-Man's suit. Blue is going to be a little bit touchy because we're going to be playing with a little bit of grays. As you know, blue is a cool color and orange is a warm color. They are polar opposites on the color wheel, so you got to be really careful when you're mixing these two components here. So for this stage, I'll be using these colors right here. Alternatively, these Games Workshop colors will work just fine. Alright, so let's get out all these colors and let's get painting the blue parts on Spider-Man's suit right now. Next off, I'm going to be using light Prussian blue and a little bit of black. As for the blue areas, I'm doing it in the reverse manner. I'm going to be starting to block out the shadows first, then I'm going to be doing the highlights. At this point of time, I'm just going to be spending more time just to block out the extreme black shadows and paying very close attention to the shapes involved. So these areas are under the ribs and under the thighs. So as you can see, once you have blocked out the shapes, the volumes automatically show themselves in the blue areas, and even without painting, this really looks very detailed already. However, now we're going on to the midtones and I'm going to be using light Prussian blue, and right here I'm also just gradually building up the shapes. Paying attention to where there are slight greys, and I'm just going to be blocking out these very slight greys on Spider-Man's suit itself. So moving on, I'm going to be using light Prussian blue plus a little bit of grey blue. This is going to be more or less the mid-tone to highlight layer. As you can see, when I'm painting these volumes, I really spend the time to break it down to shapes, and it's almost like painting by number. I think that in essence really helps me create very accurate volumes without putting too much of my own perspectives onto the model itself. So moving on, I'm going to be adding in some highlights. The highlights are going to be a little bit warmer, so I'm going to be using Radiant Flash as the initial highlights, mixed in with a little bit of light Prussian blue. The light Prussian blue picture that is supplied by AK looks a little bit strange, but it tends to be a little bit more vibrant blue. Okay, so as you can see, once we've put in these volumes, it really makes the model pop. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to be creating some undershadows, and this is going to be using medium orange plus black plus a little bit of light Prussian blue. This is where I mentioned about the grays that I did in the concept, because once you add blue and orange together, you get some kind of a gray. This creates a warm gray that we are going to be placing near the explosion. So moving on, I'm going to be adding in a little bit more orange to really boost up the color temperature of the grays that we are producing right here. So at this point of time, I'm just really focusing on the bottom left hand corner. And just now, adding in a little bit of burnt red, and this is going to be the initial reflected light and the explosion light for the rest of the armor. Okay. So as I mentioned before, red is a warm color, so in order to make it contrast from the explosion, we've got to use a cooler red. So now that the bulk of Spider-Man has been completed, we're going to move on to the web. As you can see, the webs have been portrayed in many different styles over the years in the comics. However, I'm going to be opting to do this blue-white colored web that is very commonly seen in the cartoons as well as the comics. So for this stage, I'll be using these colors right here. Alternatively, these colors will work just fine. So let's get up all these colors and let's get painting the web on Spider-Man right now. So these are the colors that I'm going to be using to base coat the webs first. I'm deliberately making the webs a little bit more blue, so just don't be alarmed because this is more like the mid-tone shadow color. However, once we have started to highlight it in lighter and more desaturated grays, it's going to be just fine. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to be using German grey plus a little bit of white. So as I mentioned, this is going to cover more than 80% of the previous colors, just leaving a little bit of the blue in the recesses itself. Now we have come to the fun part. Because the main body of Spider-Man has already been completed, we're going to be painting the explosion on this model right here. The thought process on painting this explosion, you just got to remember, any crevices closest to the model is going to be the light source. And we're going to be painting the plumes of smoke as if there's going to be a light source shining from the top. So these are the two influencing factors when painting smoke. Therefore, what you're going to get a very dark middle area where the light sources tend to meet. So for this stage, I'll be using these colors right here. Alternatively, these colors will work just fine. So let's get out all these colors right now and let's get painting the explosion and the smoke plumes on this amazing looking model right now. Alright, so we're going to start off with another exciting component, and I'm going to be using medium orange plus radiant flash. At this point of time, this is where I start to block up where the light is coming from. So as you notice, I'm doing this in sort of like a stipple technique. So I'm just stippling in the areas that the explosion is going to happen. Okay, this is gonna be at the cracks and where all the plumes join to each other. So moving on, this is going to be some medium orange, and this is where the plumes start to fade into smoke. This is going to be very lightly stippled on, just outside the area that we have just provided. This stippling technique creates this very rough texture to show that there is a layer of smoke on top of the light source, and it creates the illusion that there is multiple layers. So next up, burnt red, black and medium orange. This is going to be the shadow area. Do note at this point in time, I'm doing this with a very thinned down version. This is so that, as I mentioned before, we can start building on this very stippled, rough texture so that we create the illusion that there is smoke. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to be using blue-gray plus a bit of orange here. This is going to be the initial highlights. just like the burn red layer that we have done before. This is very thin down, and I'm just stippling this all over the model. But do pay very close attention to the volumes because most of the plumes are round, and this is what we intend for it to do. Okay, so moving on, just using a little bit of white and radiant flash, I'm just going to be creating the most extreme highlights on the plume. Also very thin down and very stippled. So as you can see, this stippling technique creates this very rough illustrator look, and this is what I definitely like a lot, as you can see in many of my paintworks. Alright guys, we're almost done with the model. Now we're going to move on to this metal scaffolding and tower that has this Daily Bugle thing. We're going to be saving some time, and we're going to be using the metallic paints right here. So for this stage, I'll be using these colors right here. Alternatively, these colors will work just fine. Alright, so let's get out all these colors and let's get painting this metal tower right now. So now we're going to be doing the scaffolding on the tower that Spider-Man is on anyways. We're just going to be doing some base coating with gunmetal. And then for the Daily Bugle symbols, what we're going to do next is we're going to be using a little bit of rusty gold. Okay, so now that the metal base coating is done, we're going to just rusty gold the little symbols that are on the scaffolding itself. I'm not going to pay too much attention to this, and right after this I'm just going to be doing a wash on the entire surface. So moving on, because we have finished the tower and the explosion, now it's time to add some finishing touches onto Spider-Man. This is where we start blending everything together to make sure that Spider-Man looks as unified and coherent to the explosion as possible. For this stage, I'll be using these colors right here. Alternatively, these colors will work just fine. So let's get out all these colors and let's put on the finishing touches on this amazing model right now. Alright, it's time for the finishing touches, and this is where we start to blend Spider-Man together with the explosion. So right here I'm going to be using medium orange. I'm going to be putting some extreme highlights to show that Spider-Man is really close to an explosion. And at this point of time, I'm focusing on the surfaces that are facing the left hand side. So moving on, I'm going to be adding a little bit of medium blue plus a little bit of medium orange, and with this I'm going to be creating some warm shadows. At this point in time, making sure that the mid shadows that we created previously tend to be a little bit on the warm side towards the left hand side of this model. So moving on, I'm going to be adding matte red, blood red, and a little bit of medium orange, and this is going to be for the shadows and the surfaces that are red facing the left hand side. We've come to the last stage of the model, and we're going to be just finishing up with the base. Of course, this is just a sidewalk, and what we're going to do it really speed painting style. I already primed this in 1005 Mr. Hobby Grey, and we're going to be just using some washes, and we're going to be putting on some of the light sources to make sure that everything remains as coherent as possible. For this stage, I'll be using these colors right here. Alternatively, these colors will work just fine. So let's get painting the base right now. Alright, here we are at the last stretch. So with the base very prime grey, I'm just going to be doing mostly washes and a little bit of touch up on the base. So I'm going to start off with an enamel wash, going all over this grey surface to start picking out some of the cracks and details. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to be adding a little bit of brown wash here. So this brown wash is to create some visual difference and create some interest on this otherwise very plain and boring concrete base. So next up, we're gonna try to merge the explosion to the base, and we're gonna be creating some light leaks. So using some burnt umber and medium orange, I'm going to be creating some weaker orange tones, and I'm just going to be placing them nearer to the areas that are not obscure. So moving on, I'm going to be adding a little bit of light orange to burnt umber, and I'm going to be doing this not only on the model itself, but also on the sidewalk, so that this looks like a more complete piece. There we have it. There's the finished model, the Amazing Spider-Man from Marvel Crisis Protocol. I really like how intricate each of the parts are, and the dynamic poses allows me to portray light sources like I've never done so before. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I really hope that you found this video useful. I really hope that this departure from Games Workshop allows us to explore many different types of models and the entire hobby of miniature painting. So if you found this video useful, I would really appreciate if you click the like and subscribe, because it helps the algorithm and allows more people to see videos such as this. And if you want to support the channel even more directly, just head on to the Patreon and sign up as a patron today. Every single dollar goes towards creating videos and painting miniatures so that we all get to become better miniature painters together. I'd like to thank all my patrons for allowing me to do this, and if you would like some feedback, remember to tag us on Instagram at Kolectiv SG, and I hope to see you in the next painting video. See you!